be a presentation about President Truman and the steel crisis. And I'm the presenter, Mark Adams, and as I mentioned, I'm here at the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. And I've been here at the library 19 years. What I like to do is have some interaction as there's just the two schools. I'm going to go to each school just to kind of figure out what do you know about this time period. 1952, Truman is president. Not necessarily what you might know about the steel crisis. If you know something about that, that would be good too. But just in general, what is going on in the world in 1952? What situations does Truman face as president? Those kinds of things. So I can't identify which class is which, but I see a couple of hands started to raise. I saw a gentleman in a red t-shirt and a gentleman in a white shirt with a yellow logo start to raise a hand. So I'm going to call on that school. That's you, sir. So I'm going to call on you first, if you would. What do you know about what's happening in 1952 and the types of situations President Truman is facing?
It was after World War II.
It was after World War II. And so what situations faced President Truman? And your friends can help you out.
What do y'all think? Well, we just went to war.
Oh.
So what is he going to have to take care of?
Of the army.
We just went to war, and then he has to take care of the nation and the things that have been destroyed.
Okay, so the war is over. We're 7 years removed from the end of World War II, right? So the war is over. And what does the situation look like in Europe, for example? What does Europe look like in 1952? Post-World War II, what does Europe look like?
It's pretty destroyed.
It's been destroyed. Okay, very good. And is everybody getting along?
No.
Okay, so all of the Allies from World War II, what's the situation with the Allies from World War II? The British, the Americans, and the Soviet Union. What's the situation there?
We're having a Cold War.
They're having a Cold War. Excellent. Very good. Now you guys did a great job. Thank you. I'm going to come back to you, so be on your toes. This is going to be two-way communication today. We're going to go to the other classroom, which on my screen is on the bottom of the screen. With those, we just talked about Europe. What is happening in Asia in 1952? So maybe a tougher question for the other class, but what is happening in Asia? Anybody from that group want to help me out here? Say that again. Yes, in the red or orange. My picture's a little blurry. I see a hand raised. Go right ahead.
Pearl Harbor, I think.
Well, Pearl Harbor was about 10 years before, so this is after World War II. What's happening in Asia? Can you see that? Any clues there? Any clues from that classroom? That map helping you?
The Korean War.
The Korean War. So in 1950, the Korean War had started. So this is post-World War II. The Korean War had started. North Koreans had invaded South Korea. And President Truman sent troops to stop that spread of communism. So it's all tied in with the Cold War in Europe and the Cold War in Asia. So we have the Korean War. It started in 1950, so we're about 2 years in. So that's part of what's going on in the world at that time. Okay? Let me switch to my PowerPoint and show you some information, and then I'm going to come back to you to get some more of your questions and responses to some of the information I'm going to show you here in a second. So we're going to be talking about President Truman and the steel crisis, which takes place in 1952, as I've said. And the big question here is, during the Korean War, did President Truman have the power to take over the steel mills to ensure their continued operation during a strike? So we're going to learn a little about this crisis, the fact that there's a strike in the steel industry, and President Truman wants to take over the steel mills. So that's kind of the essential question we're going to be looking at. Did he have the authority to actually do that? If you think about that in today's world in 2016, if you could imagine a president authorizing the government to take over an industry. And that's what Truman did in 1952. He took over the steel mills, put it under government control because the steel workers were on strike. So what we're going to do here, and we're going to really hope the technology cooperates, is we're going to listen to a speech that Truman made, so one of our primary sources here in the Truman Library. Listen to one of his speeches, and I want you to listen very, very carefully. Now, I realize the audio might be a little low. We've got it as high as we can get it on our machines here for you. Don't worry if you can't capture all of it. I've got some of it typed up that we can look at after the audio has played. What I want you to listen for, though, and I'm going to ask you, are what reasons Truman gives for doing this. So as you're listening to part of this speech, and we're just going to play a minute or two of it, I want you to be writing down any reasons you can hear that Truman gives for taking over the steel mills. So let me get this ready for you.
In Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
My fellow Americans, tonight our country faces a grave danger. We are faced by the possibility that at midnight tonight, the steel industry will be shut down. This must not happen. Steel is our key industry. It is vital to the defense effort. It is vital to peace. We do not have a stockpile of the kinds of steel we need for defense. Steel is flowing directly to the plants that make it into defense production. If steel production stops, we will have to stop making the shells and bombs that are going directly to our soldiers at the front in Korea. If steel production stops, we will have to cut down and delay the atomic energy program. If steel production stops, it won't be long before we have to stop making engines for the Air Force planes. These would be the immediate effects if the steel mills closed down. A prolonged shutdown would bring defense production to a halt and throw our domestic economy into chaos. These are not normal times. These are times of crisis. We've been working and fighting to prevent the outbreak of world war. So far, we have succeeded. The most important element in this successful struggle has been our defense program. If that is stopped, the situation can change overnight. All around the world, we face the threat of military action by the forces of aggression. Our growing strength is holding these forces in check. If our strength fails, these forces may break out in renewed violence and bloodshed. Our national security and our chances for peace depend on our defense production. Our defense production depends on steel. As your president, I have to think about the effects that a steel shutdown here would have all over the world. I have to think about our soldiers in Korea facing the Chinese communists, and about our soldiers and our allies in Europe confronted by the military power masked behind the Iron Curtain. I have to think of the danger to our security if we are forced, for lack of steel, to cut down on our atomic energy program. I have no doubt that if our defense program fails, the danger of war, the possibility of hostile attack, grows much greater. It would not be faithful, I would not be faithful to my responsibilities as president if I did not use every effort to keep this from happening. For American troops fail.
Okay, I'm just going to switch back so you can see me. There we go. Were you able to hear that okay? Let's go ahead and switch your audio back on. I'm getting a thumbs up, which is good. So, let's see, the class, go ahead.
Yeah, we could hear some of it, not all of it, but bits and
All right.
pieces.
Okay, it's typical. Now, just to let the teachers know, that speech is available on the Truman Library website. So I will email that out to the teacher today so that you can listen to that again. And we also have a transcript so you can see it typed out as well. And we're going to look at some quotes from it here in a second. And I realize the audio was difficult, but the second group that participated before, were you able to capture any reasons that you could hear on the audio? Maybe somebody as a spokesperson for the class could give us some of the reasons they could hear for Truman's actions.
Hey, Betty, we have one. She's coming.
Very good.
During President Truman's speech, he talked about how the steel production was critical to the defense and the offense in the Korean War.
Very good. Excellent. Anybody else? Anything specific within that?
Let's get someone else. Yeah, go ahead. Do you have another idea? Do something else. Okay, go ahead, Gabriel. So what did he say about engines? Just think what he said about.
As they were going on a strike, they can't, Harriman,
Oh, there we go.
Truman can't get them to build stuff because since they're on the strike and they can't build them.
What kind of stuff? What kind of things did he say you couldn't build, like, specifically?
Like the mills.
Engines. What else did you guys hear? What else did he say? Did you bring anything up, Amy? You're breaking up. Someone else? Well, I saw you guys writing things down. Yes, don't be shy. Huh? Betty, go ahead.
Bombshells?
Bombshells, we heard.
Okay. I think I heard somebody say engines. Okay, let's go ahead. You guys did a good job. Let's go ahead and switch to the other class. So if you want to, that class, if you want to mute your audio for a second, and we'll switch to the other class. You're doing a good job switching back and forth. Let's go to the other class and have some volunteers there to give us some reasons why Truman did this.
Go ahead, say what we saw. Go ahead.
They needed weapons, and if they were on strike, they were not like have anything to work with.
Right, so they needed weapons.
Tanks and other type of weapons, bombs, nuclear stuff, and stuff like that.
So all the things they needed for the military. What was, any other reasons that you could hear? And I realize the audio was tricky.
It was really hard to hear. That's basically
Sure.
what we got out of it.
Okay, let me show you some, let me switch back. I've got some of the quotes, so hopefully you can read these on the screen here. Just let me switch back to the PowerPoint, and we'll look at these a little more closely. Okay, so here we have one I'm going to read to you, because this is directly from the speech, and you guys got some of this. If steel production stops, we'll have to stop making the shells and bombs that are going to go directly to our soldiers at the front in Korea. So you guys talked about the shells and the bombs. And if steel production stops, we'll have to cut down and delay the atomic energy program. So if you remember, Truman had dropped the atomic bomb in 1945. Since then, atomic energy had become a huge program for the United States. And then he says, if steel production stops, it won't be long before we have to stop making engines for the Air Force planes. And I think one of the groups mentioned the engines. Got one more slide of reasons, and this one, he's less specific about bombs and shells and engines, and he starts to talk about the enemy. So he says, I have to think about our soldiers in Korea facing the Chinese communists, and about our soldiers and allies in Europe confronted by military powers masked behind the Iron Curtain. I have to think of the dangers to our security if we are forced for lack of steel to cut down on our atomic energy program. So he comes back to atomic energy. And then last paragraph, I have no doubt that if our defense program fails, the danger of war, the possibility of hostile attack grows much greater. I would not be faithful to my responsibilities as president if I did not use every effort to keep this from happening. So was there anything new there that you didn't, I know you couldn't hear the audio very well, was there anything new there that he introduced as a reason that you hadn't heard before? Either class. Anything new?
Go to war again.
We could have gone to war again.
He wanted to stop. Louder.
We could go to war again.
We could go to war again. Okay. Anything else?
You didn't want that to happen?
He
He didn't want that to happen. Okay.
responsibility.
And that was his responsibility.
Come closer.
How about this class? The other class, anything else new there?
He's got it. Scoot back, Benjamin. Scoot back. There we go.
Okay.
Go ahead.
If he said that if the steel production stopped, that America's defense would get low, and then.
Okay, Betty, go ahead and ask something else. Anyone else?
One more maybe?
So if America's steel production lowered, our defense as well would be lowered, and we would be more open to hostile attacks, as well as he's concerned for the safety of the troops in Korea and the Allied troops in Europe as well.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you, both groups. So you have a number of different reasons there: atomic energy, the fact that they might come under attack. I have one more question for you. How did he describe the enemy? He talked about the Korean War, but how did he describe the enemy? What big word with a C did he use? As it's part of the Cold War.
Say it. Say it louder.
Communists. And if you ever look at Truman's speeches at this time period, he's referring a lot to communists. He doesn't always mention specifically the other countries, but he mentions communists. So for example, in 1947, when he unveils his new policy of the Truman Doctrine, which everybody realized was against the Soviet Union, he never mentions the Soviet Union's name once, but he refers to communists over and over and over. So this is part of a bigger foreign policy. Even though the steel crisis is domestically in the United States, it's very much part of his policy against communism. And without the steel industry, he can't fight that fight against communism. So that's a big, important part of this. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at how some different groups reacted. So how the unions reacted, how the steel mills reacted, and so on. And then eventually we're going to go look at the Supreme Court. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, and then I will come back to you. So if you work both classrooms would like to mute for a second, I'm going to go through a little bit of information to give you some background, and then we'll see what the Supreme Court has to say as they get involved. So we're going to switch back to PowerPoint. And there's where we are. We were looking at Truman's reasons. Now, I know this might not be easy to see, but I'm going to read from it so you get the information. I'll be glad to email the PowerPoint to the teachers later today. This is not the union that was involved. This is a union of longshoremen, and it's from the Dispatcher newsletter in 1952. And this is from an editorial. And it might give you a sense of not every union backed what Truman was doing, where Truman was trying to back the union and seize the industry so they could get better pay. So this particular newspaper or newsletter was called the Dispatcher, and it's the official newspaper of the longshoremen and warehouse keepers, and published in 1952, so right at the time of the crisis. And I'm just going to read a part of it. It says, no matter how badly we want the steelworkers to get their long overdue wage boost. So they agree with the steelworkers' demands. And we surely do, because their present wages and conditions are a drag on all labor. It would be a mistake not to recognize the danger in this seizure business, whether by inherent power or by statutory authority. This fact stands out. And this is the important part. If the president can seize an industry and in the national interest order improvement in wages and conditions, they can also, in the national interest, seize an industry and order the reverse. That is, he can order wages cut and conditions worsened. It is a sword with two edges, and one which should not be trusted to any man's hands, much less the corrupt, bungling hands of Truman's political administration. So, what is this? I'm going to ask you a quick question on this and we'll move forward again. What is this newsletter saying about the crisis? Either classroom. Don't be shy.
Word. Yeah, go ahead, Melvin. Wow, come on.
That it's a double-edged sword. One of which should not be trusted in Truman's hand, and especially not Truman's.
Why? Say why.
It's Truman's corrupted hands.
Yeah,
So they're calling Truman.
Saying Truman is corrupt. What's the danger?
That he has conditions worse for the steel workers.
It might make conditions worse, is that what you said?
Yes.
Very good. Okay, go ahead and mute your mics again, because I want you to get through this quickly. I'm cognizant of time, so you did a great job there. Thank you for responding. I appreciate it. I know it's difficult. So let's look at what Truman does. So you heard that speech earlier. So first of all, these are direct quotes from Truman's speech, the end of it. We just listened to the beginning of it before. It says, first of all, he's directing the Secretary of Commerce to take possession of the steel mills. I'm going to paraphrase here. Second, he's directing the Acting Director of Defense Mobilization to get the representatives of the steel companies and the steel workers to Washington to get them to settle their dispute. And he's thinking these measures are the only way to prevent a shutdown and to keep steel production rolling. It's hoped that this will bring about a quick settlement of the dispute. So he does two things. He has the Secretary of Commerce take possession of the steel mills, but then he also tells both sides to come to the negotiating table to settle the dispute quickly. Okay, so the steel mill owners, they're opposed to Truman's actions, and they think that it's unconstitutional because it was not authorized by law, and they took the case to the Supreme Court. Truman argued that as commander-in-chief, he could do this, and he referenced other times in history that the government had seized private property during war. So he felt he had lawyers backing him, and that's what they felt he could do. So it goes to the Supreme Court, and the court disagreed with Truman and held that neither the Constitution or any act of Congress allowed Truman to take over the steel mills. And we quote from the Supreme Court decision, "The president's power, if any, to issue the order must stem from an act of Congress or from the Constitution itself." And there was no act of Congress, and so the court turned to the Constitution. And the court ruled that the president's role of commander-in-chief did not authorize the action, and neither did the several constitutional provisions that grant executive power to the president. And they concluded, in the framework of our Constitution, the president's power to see that the laws are faithfully executed refutes the idea that he is to be a lawmaker. So the Supreme Court comes down against President Truman. Okay? All right. Now we have reaction. Let me switch to me for a second. So now we have the reaction afterwards. So the Supreme Court has gone against Truman, which he was surprised about. Just as an aside, all of those Supreme Court justices, all 9 of them on the Supreme Court, had all been put there by Democratic presidents, either by Truman or by his predecessor, Franklin Roosevelt. So you might have expected them to side with Truman, but they did not. Another piece that they mentioned is that Truman had never gone to Congress to authorize the Korean War. He went through the United Nations. And that's why the court was able to rule against him, because Congress had never authorized the Korean War. So, for example, in World War II, Congress had authorized that war. And so when things like this happened in World War II or in previous wars, you had congressional backing. He didn't have that with the Korean War. He'd gone to the United Nations and they called it a police action rather than a war. Sounds technical, but it's one of the things that the Supreme Court referenced, that there had been no congressional action to authorize the war. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 2 political cartoons. So we're going to look at each in turn. I'm going to put them up on the computer here in a second. If you need to move in closer to the screen, hopefully your teachers can see that. I'm hoping when you look at them, they're detailed enough. And I just want you to see what you can notice from these cartoons, and then we're going to look at one at a time. We'll discuss each one with both classes. So be ready to volunteer. Don't be shy. I know it's difficult, but don't be shy to come up and offer what you see from these cartoons. So let me switch back to the first one. Our remotes are working beautifully, so we're able to switch back. Can you see that okay? I know it's some detail there. Hopefully it's not too fuzzy. So take a moment to study that. If you need to come closer to the screen maybe, or to help somebody read some of the detail.
Can you read that?
It's the horse. It does say Missouri.
So there may be just a few words you can read. Is there anybody able to read that?
The Missouri Mule.
So you see the Missouri Mule. So who might be the Missouri Mule? Truman, very good. What does it say on the side of the mule?
We can't read it. We cannot read it.
We can't read it. Grounds for impeachment. And impeachment, what's impeachment? When someone gets kicked out of presidency, yeah.
So grounds for impeachment.
Didn't I just?
Let me give you a bit of information, okay? Since you can't read some of those. on the side of the mule, there's kind of a cloth, and it says, Truman's Stubborn Stand. And then there's a gentleman at the back with a hat on. Can you see what it says on his hat?
Congress?
It does say Congress, very good. And then he has like a speech balloon above him, and it says, well, there's plenty of wood to start a fire under him, and that's a pile of wood behind him where it says grounds of impeachment. Those are all logs behind him, and this gentleman is saying, well, there's plenty of wood to start a fire under him. And then, do you see the plow in the ground that's kind of black, and it has white letters on it? Down at the gentleman's feet. And on that plow it says Steel Crisis. So what would you say is, what do you notice in that cartoon? What is the opinion of the cartoonist?
So, Gania?
No. That Truman shouldn't be president anymore.
That he shouldn't be president because they're talking about impeachment, right? Anything else?
No. Not now. Not now. Anything else? What else? Kendall, anything else you notice about that cartoon? What do you how does the cartoonist feel about it?
He's
What
taking
makes
the
it different?
industry to the ground.
Say it louder.
He's trying to take the industry to the ground.
Taking the industry into the ground, very good. What about Congress? Whose side are Congress on?
The industry. The industry.
It's so, they use the word
Yeah, they're on the
stubborn.
inside.
What are they saying about he is? He was personal. Yeah. Think of a mule. It's like, what else? Think about like the symbolism with like the animal too, is of the animal, and then they saying that what? Go ahead, Gabriel, you can try it.
It's like
Calm you again.
the logs represent like excuses for the Truman, so he would to make impeachment to start the fire on his stand, and the mule stands well like the Democrats, I think.
Democrats, right? And if you look at the mule really, really closely, and I know it's fuzzy, but the mule is wearing glasses. Why would the mule be wearing glasses? Anybody from either classroom? Why would the mule
Why do you
be
think he's
wearing
wearing
glasses?
glasses? Anyone? Benjamin, you say it, and I say, oh, sorry, Brittany. Brittany, come on. Brittany, she had her hand raised too. You can say it quickly. She's coming. Bye, Brittany.
That's fine. You guys are doing a great job.
To Truman, and the Congress is using the laws to try to impeach
And did you say who is wearing glasses? Who are they representing?
Truman.
Truman, very good. Let's move on to the next one. I've got one more cartoon. You guys are doing a really good job. There's a little less writing on this one and more action, so it might be easier to interpret. So on this one, let me take a look at this one, and I'll read some of the words because I know the words can be tricky to read. At the very top, the heading is "That Boarding House Reach." Then the gentleman with the big long arm, on his sleeve it says "Steel Seizure." And then you can probably read what it says on the mallet at the front. What does it say on the front?
Supreme Court.
Supreme Court, thank you very much. So who would like to try and interpret this cartoon for me? What's happening?
Come, Michael. Michael. Why are you guys so shut up? We have a question. Come on, Michael. We have one. Michael, come on. Represent. Michael. Okay. Go ahead.
All right. So what was the question?
So how would you interpret it? Interpret the cartoon.
Interpret that. quick, you didn't see me, I'm pretty tall.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Get on my level.
Go ahead. You're good.
Alright, it represents, I'm camera shy.
Oh, come on.
Okay, hold on. Let me think. Okay, it represents the Supreme Court trying to like get rid of the president or Truman or whatever. Right? I'm right?
Close. Not necessarily getting rid of the president, but
Danny, come on.
It represents the Supreme Court having more power over the president.
having more power. Who is the president in this picture?
The president's trying to beg the Supreme Court, right? Almost.
The president's trying to beg the Supreme Court.
So what is the president doing?
He's trying to stop the Supreme Court from making the law,
Making a decision.
making a decision.
Right, what's he reaching out for?
He's trying to stop the hammer from getting the gamblers.
Well, actually, he's trying to reach the plate, which looks like it's got cookies on it or something, that represents the steel mills. He's reaching out to seize those, and the Supreme Court's hammer is coming down and stopping him grabbing the plate. Does that make sense? So he's reaching out, and by showing a longer arm, the cartoonist is saying he's overreaching. He's reaching too far, he's overexerting his power, and Supreme Court hammer comes down, or mallet comes down, and stops him taking those. You guys did a good job with that. Okay, let me switch back. Okay, so the idea there of those cartoons is that both of those were against Truman, and I looked and looked and looked for newspapers and cartoons and editorials that favored Truman, and there were very few. Almost unanimously, people realized that Truman had gone too far, and people suggested lots of other ways that he could have acted, but he failed to do that. He thought that in time of war that he had kind of more authority, but in fact, the Congress and Supreme Court both disagreed with that. And so Supreme Court overturned his decision, and he complied. He didn't disagree with that. He went to Congress to try and get them to authorize seizing of the mill. So what we're going to do for the next couple of minutes is just show you how this crisis ended, kind of the aftermath, and then I want you to be ready with any questions you might have that we can answer before our time is up, because we have just over 5 minutes. So let me switch back, show you the aftermath, and then we'll have some questions to wrap up. So just a few hours after the Supreme Court decision, Truman ordered the Commerce Secretary to return controls, and this time, instead of seizing it, he went to Congress to ask for the authority. Now you have to remember that he was facing a Republican Congress, and so they refused, and then a strike began. So the strike that he'd been trying to avoid all along started, and about 600,000 steel workers went on strike for more than 7 weeks. It was eventually settled in mid-July. The workers eventually got what they wanted in the first place, and you can see the economic loss was estimated about $4 billion, and that's in 1952 money, and you've got the money in 2016 dollars there, and about 1.5 million people were unemployed, and about 19 million tons of steel was lost, about 90% of all steel production. But there was enough of a backlog that it didn't really affect the war effort, because they did settle in about 7 weeks. The leaders of the union considered this a win, a victory for them, because they did get the demands they wanted. And it's the first time the union had won over against the steel industry in American history. So things to consider. During the Korean War, did Truman have the power to take them over? Well, the Supreme Court said no, but you might have a different opinion about that. So that might be something you could look at, whether you agree with the Supreme Court or not. It was a split decision, 6-3. So there were some Chief Justices that agreed with President Truman. You could look at, why did he do this? Was it just for the war, or was it other reasons involved? And why did the US Supreme Court rule that it was unconstitutional? So these are questions that you can think about and have class discussions about. And finally, can you think of any situations today where the president might have power similar to what Truman sought to exercise in 1952? And if you do think of any, you could discuss those, be specific. Would they be related to foreign relations or extended to domestic issues? So just things to consider. So we have about 5 minutes left. And I want to see if either class has any questions about this or about President Truman in general that you'd like to ask me, and I can share my responses with you. Don't forget to turn your sound back on.
Go ahead. Loud.
How many presidential terms did Truman serve?
So Truman was president for just under 2 terms. Remember, when he became president in 1945, that was after Franklin Roosevelt's death. So that first term was about 3 months shy of 4 years, so about 3 3/4 years. Then he was re-elected in 1948, and he served a full 4-year term. So he was president just over 7.5 years, so just under 2 terms, because that first term he was vice president and then took over for Roosevelt after Roosevelt died. So he was vice president for 3 months, and then president for the remaining 3 months, remaining 9 months of that year, and then another 3 years. So 7 years, 9 months. Good question. Other questions Truman related or related to this crisis? While you're thinking of a question, I should tell you, in relation to primary sources, we have 16 million primary source documents here in our library, and we have about 60,000 primary sources on our website, including the speech that you listened to today. So you have lots of primary sources that you can get access to in relation to many, many topics related to Truman. Let's get a question from the other classroom. Don't be shy. Anything Truman related? I see a hand raised, maybe.
Go ahead, Betty. Do you think President Obama or any of the presidential candidates today are like somewhat close to what Truman did?
In terms of his beliefs?
Yes.
In terms of his beliefs, is that what you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, I would think, well, as he was a Democrat, I would assume that either Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders are probably closer to Truman in terms of the philosophy. Truman, for example, wanted universal health care and tried to do that in the 1940s and failed. So he would certainly be more towards either Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders in his political beliefs. Good question.
Any other questions?
Any final questions?
No.
No.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the other group?
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.